right, so in today's class we're going to talk about the presidents James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, presidents number 5 and 6. I know last week there was a lot of stuff we tried to cover and it was rushed and everything, but at the end of the class we talked about the War of 1812, which kind of gets started under Jefferson, at least in terms of the issues that led up to us, and then it's mostly Madison who's president when it's happening. The fact that we were able to withstand Great Britain again, I mean, I don't really call that we won that war, because we didn't really have to win it, we just had to not lose. So we were able to do that. Britain was willing to settle again with us instead of having to continue the fight. And so some people will refer to that as the second war for American independence, because we had to fight Britain again and show them that we could actually stand on our own. After that war was over with, there were definitely things about that war that revealed some problems in our country. And as we move into the period after the war, which was 1815 or so was when the war came to an end, we were trying to use that period to look at some of those issues and try to resolve some of those things. And so one of the problems during the war that we realized was that we didn't have a very good system of roads and canals to be able to move equipment and people across the country. So when you're trying to fight a war and it's difficult for you to move stuff, you realize this is a problem. The other thing is we also realized we didn't have much of a manufacturing sector. So the things we needed to produce for the war, we weren't able to produce. We had been used to buying those from Great Britain. Well, Britain's not going to sell to us when we're fighting them, right? So those are some of the things we had to think about as the war came to an end, because if this happens again, we want to be in a better position. So Henry Clay at this time was one of our congressmen, and he proposed something that has come to be known as the American system. And he was basically saying, in order to strengthen our country, to make it a more unified country, because we still kind of had a mentality of individual states as opposed to one national identity, there were 3 things that he felt we needed to do. And these are the 3 things that he came up with. A strong banking system needs to continue. Now, we had the Bank of the United States that had been started under Hamilton, but that bank had only been chartered for 20 years, and it had come to the point of being, it was expired, and they didn't have a national bank. Clay felt very strongly that we needed to institute a new national bank, so that was one of the things he was fighting for. And he was able to get that passed. So the second Bank of the United States was started in 1816 for another 20-year period. Now, the bank is going to become a major issue in this country in the 1830s, because it's going to expire in 1836, so it's going to become another issue later. Second thing he wanted was a protective tariff, because if we're going to really try to help American manufacturers, we need to do it by protecting them in terms of they need to be able to sell their goods cheaper than people that are trying to import from outside the country. In order to do that, you put a tariff on goods. Does everybody know what that is? You understand what a tariff is? It's basically a tax on imported goods. So if you put that tax on those imported goods, then that manufacturer is probably going to have to charge a higher price, because he won't be able to make any profit unless he does that. That usually makes the product higher than what an American manufacturer can sell it for here. So tariff on imports is something that he thought was important, so we could really help with our manufacturing, or American manufacturing. And then he felt that we needed to have a network of roads and canals. Well, everybody agreed with that. What's the problem with this?
So that would be paid for
Yeah.
or by the states.
It all, it's all a wonderful idea. Oh yeah, let's do that. Well, then the question becomes who pays for it. And he was suggesting that the federal government at least subsidize this. That the federal government needs to help the states with this, because it's going to help the federal government as a whole. Now, the first 2 things, well, they got passed. This one became a sticking point, because the federal government didn't necessarily want to commit to having to do this. So in the next few years after the war came to an end, the first 2 happened pretty quickly. This one was a kind of an ongoing debate. which caused many states to do their own thing, one of which was the Erie Canal, which became the most famous canal in America, which was done by New York. New York just went ahead and did it because they felt it was important enough to their economy, and they ended up being able to pay it off within 7 years of creating it because of the tolls that they charged. So it kind of set the stage for lots of canal building in the 1830s in particular because of the example that the Erie Canal set. I don't know if you guys have ever looked for history videos on YouTube. I would say 90% of them are done by middle school and high schoolers. And some of them are pretty good and some of them are horrible. And then the other ones are done by history professors, and many of them are horrible. I'm assuming this is done by a teacher. I don't know what level. It's not exciting. But
The American System Study Guide. Henry Clay had a great ability to find compromise when others could not. Because of his ability to find these compromises in difficult situations, he became known as the Great Compromiser. After the Tariff of 1816, the South was very unhappy. The tariff made the goods that they imported from Europe more expensive, and therefore was costing them money, while the North, on the other hand, was being protected and actually making money because of the tariff. People were buying American. The South also felt that the North and the government, Congress, did not care whether they were happy or not, and could not care less if these tariffs were having a negative impact on their Southern economy. These feelings were causing something called sectionalism, which is a split in the country between the people living in the North, the people living in the South, and the people living in the West. Sectionalism is when people are more loyal to the section of the country they live in than they are to the country as a whole. That causes problems when you're one united country and some of your people are only concerned about what's happening to them rather than what's happening to the country. The American system was a plan designed to strengthen and unify the nation and hopefully deal with some of these issues about sectionalism. The plan was suggested by Henry Clay and supported by the Whig Party, including people like John C. Calhoun. The plan included support of a high protective tariff to keep all public land prices high so when they were sold they could generate federal revenue, which meant money, income. Keep a Bank of the United States. The first Bank of the United States charter had expired. So they had to make the decision whether to create a second Bank of the United States or to give up on it and stick only with the state and local banks. And finally, the plan suggested developing a system of internal improvements, like roads, bridges, canals, and railroads, that would help unite the country together. And because people would now be able to transport themselves and goods between all three sections more easily and more quickly, they hoped that people begin to feel more like a single country rather than three isolated sections. Now, these improvements were going to be quite expensive, and so the suggestion was that the extra revenue from the high tariff and the money made from the selling the land would be used to finance these improvements. Not everybody was excited about the idea of the American system. So Clay discussed and argued with people over it, and as he was making his arguments in support of his system, and the tariff especially, he explained to the people in the West that they should support these tariffs because the Northerners consumed the food that the Westerners sent them. So if the Northerners had more money, then that would be more money to go to the West when they bought their food. The South was really against this tariff. We talked about how they felt like the North didn't care about them. So when he talked to the Southerners, he told them that they should support the tariff because the North was a ready market for their cotton. Despite the fact that there was a lot of bickering and fighting between the three sections and a lot of jealousy over who was getting special treatment, Congress did enact parts of the American system. The whole plan was never approved, but pieces of it were approved. The charter for a second Bank of the United States, the high tariffs on imported and exported goods. What didn't happen was the internal improvements. There was never quite enough money. They never quite got the appropriations from Congress to be able to effectively complete the entire road system that Henry Clay had envisioned. Yes, we did build roads, canals, railroads, all of that. But a lot of the money came from the states or came from private investors. And that was not what the original plan was. A lot of the reason that the American system didn't work and was never actually put into place was because of all the sectional jealousies. It's very hard to appease and make people happy when they're constantly bickering and feeling like they're not getting what they want. And so despite the fact that the American system as a whole plan didn't work, many of the parts of the American system were applied and did help to build somewhat of an infrastructure for connecting the three sections of the United States. And now you know a little bit about the American system and Henry Clay.
During the first quarter of the 19th century, besides Mexico, almost every other important colony in Latin America gained independence from its mother country.
It's funny that the most defined state on that sectional map was Texas. It was just sticking out like a sore thumb there. Not much has changed.
Yeah, I didn't say that. You said sore thumb. All right, so kind of gives you an idea about the American system, and there were some things that she said in that were kind of bringing into play, like she mentioned railroads, but railroads were not part of this at the time because we didn't even have our first railroad in the country until the 1830s. This was 1816 that Henry Clay was promoting this. It was more about roads and canals. Railroads, even the very first railroad line was a whopping 13 miles long, and it connected two small, not small necessarily, I forget Baltimore and something else, I think. And most of the railroads in the 1830s were just connecting two towns. There was no plan or system for how it would all work together. And a lot of times, we'll talk more about this later, but a lot of times the railroad lines that they laid, the width of the tracks were different. So you might have one that joined two cities together, and then another, 5 miles away, you have another one that joined two cities together, but they can't connect those two because the tracks are all different widths. And the cars that they had to build to put on those tracks were all different. So you could have two railroad systems 5 miles apart that they couldn't connect without laying all different tracks. There was not a good overall system to this. So it took us a long time. It wasn't really till the 1850s that railroads really take off, and that's when we decided to get smart and have a standard system. All the tracks would be the same width apart. The width of tracks now is something like some weird number, like 48 and 5/8 inches. It's not like an exact 48 inches. It's some weird number. And I had read that, and I decided a few years ago that I needed to verify that. So I'm driving one day, and I just come up to a railroad track, and I thought, oh, this is a good time to just jump out of the car and go check. So I pulled over and jumped out of my car with my tape measure and measured it, and lo and behold, it was what I had read exactly. So,
I can see.
yeah. And so all of you, your assignment this week is to go check the width of the railroad track someplace, and then we'll all come back and report our findings, and they should all be the same, right? Except for the one who dies because they get run over by somebody as they do it. Anyway, so we finally got smart and did that appropriately. Also, after the War of 1812, we brought a lot of new states into the Union. So Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, Alabama, 1819. So the expansion and the bringing in more states, what does that do for us politically?
It strengthens the government politically because population gives us more of a vote.
Makes Congress bigger because they're adding representatives.
That's what I'm getting at. Having more actual states means you have more representatives, right? You have more senators. So depending on the population, you have more people in the House of Representatives. And then every state gets how many senators? Two, right? So where are these states? What part of the country?
They're all north, south.
Mississippi, Alabama, South, Indiana, Illinois. If you divide it between North and South, those two would be North, right? So the issue here is that at this point in our history, most slavery, there is still some slavery in the North, but most of it is in the South because it's a more agricultural community and the North is becoming more industrial. And they don't need slaves as much. They need cheap labor, but they don't necessarily use slaves. So what we started doing in this period of time is we liked having states come in that you'd get one slave and one free, one slave and one free. Because that way in Congress, when the states would vote, you'd have an even number of slave states and free states. And that way neither side felt that they were being outvoted just because of the region of the country. So I don't know that it was originally intentional, but it became intentional just to try to keep everybody happy. So even at this point, slavery is starting to be an issue that they feel that they have to compromise on. Okay? Just keep that in mind and we'll talk about some things. So election of 1816 is when James Monroe was elected. I call him a Republican here, but I really should call him a Democratic Republican because we don't have Republicans yet, remember? And he will be reelected in 1820, so he's going to serve 8 years. Now, just to put this in perspective, first president was who?
Washington.
Second president was?
Adams. Jefferson.
And what are these two as far as party? Federalist. And then who's our third president?
Jefferson.
Fourth president? Fourth president?
Monroe.
Fourth president?
Madison.
Come on, guys. We're not even to the hard ones yet. And then fifth president? Monroe. Okay, Jefferson will serve 2 terms. Madison will serve 2 terms. Monroe will serve 2 terms. What party are they? Democratic Republican, right? So we had 12 years. Remember, he served 2 terms. He only served 1. So we had 12 years of Federalists. Now we've had 24 years in a row of Democratic Republicans. Jefferson, 1800, 1804. Madison, 1808, 1812. And then Monroe is going to run 1816, 1820. Tell me, how long would it take you to write down everything you know about James Monroe?
Last time, I think you say that.
Seriously, I mean, what do we know about James Monroe? Not much, right? The only thing that, even if you study history, the only thing that most people know about James Monroe, if they know anything, is the Monroe Doctrine. Most of his presidency was pretty smooth. Not a lot of issues during his presidency. It's actually referred to as the era of good feelings. Stupid expression, but I guess it makes sense. So the main thing that is talked about, and even at the time, it wasn't considered that important. The Monroe Doctrine was a statement made by our president, kind of an assertion to the rest of the world. And what were we telling the rest of the world?
Don't mess with the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. We got it under control. We're going to handle things over here. If you come into the Western Hemisphere, what will we take that as?
An unfriendly act.
Yeah, basically a threat to us, right? And we will come after you. What is the problem with that in 1819?
Still not that big.
Yeah, what are we going to come after them with? Water pistols, right? We don't have much of an army or a navy. It's, you know, it's like trash talking. And sometimes people can trash talk and they can back it up. Other times, not so much. You know, you watch football players all the time, you know, and the way that they go at each other on the football field. I'm a big NFL fan, so I watch a lot of football, especially on Sundays, and it just cracks me up the way some of those guys do things. I mean, you get this tiniest little guy out there, and I mean, of course, he's bigger than me by all means, but compared to some of those guys, and they'll be the ones that are in the face of these dudes, and I'm thinking, are you nuts?
That's kind of the standard everywhere. The smallest dude talks
Yeah.
the most.
Well, my son played some sports in high school because he went to a very small high school and pretty much they let anybody on the team. And he wasn't any good. I mean, he really wasn't. I mean, to the point, especially when he played football, I couldn't even watch. I just had to, like, keep my head down because it was so painful. Because he's big. He was a big kid. He was bigger than most of the kids out there. But
Couldn't get out of his own way.
no, he couldn't. And, you know, when you're playing on the line in football, you've got to move quickly, you know. You have to get up off that line and you know, he would be trying to rush the quarterback. And the play would be over with, and he would still be in his stance. It was like, what is wrong with you? And then they would put him on special teams, you know, when they kicked off. He never even got close to the guy with the football. Never close. It was like, do you even see where the football is? Why are you running that way? But my point is, he was the biggest trash talker of anybody in the school. And it was like, there's no way you can back up what you're saying.
Writing checks that you can't cash.
Yeah. Anyway, so Monroe puts out this big statement, and today, we still live by this. I mean, in this day and age, the Monroe Doctrine is gospel to us and the rest of the world. People know, do not come into our hemisphere. But we have a little bit more power to back it up now. You know, when you go back to Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that, I mean, people knew, I mean, we were on the brink of nuclear warfare because of the Russians trying to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. And I mean, you guys weren't alive then, and I was like 3, so I don't remember it, but from talking to my parents and stuff, I mean, it was a really scary moment for us because we told them this is our hemisphere. You shouldn't be here, and you're trying to do this, and we are not going to tolerate this. And it was one of those literal, they're inching toward Cuba. Kennedy, apparently, his finger is right above the supposedly red button, and luckily, Russia turned back and we didn't have nuclear warfare. But so this is what it called for, but at the time, if anybody had called our bluff, we might have been in big trouble. So that's why we refer to it as a large bark from a very small dog.
So was it because we won, or basically won 2 very improbable wars that people were like, well, maybe we should take it seriously like that? Like after Revolutionary 1812, like,
I'm sure there's some truth to that because they definitely saw us at least withstand Great Britain twice. Some of it's just that they have other things going on. It wasn't like they were absolutely needing to do something here. And it was really directed at Spain at this point in time because it was the Spanish colonies that we were recognizing their independence. But Spain was not in the position to do anything because their empire was falling apart. That's why all of their colonies were declaring their independence, because they could. Spain didn't have the wherewithal to really step in and do anything about it. Hey.
I left my jump drives. Yeah, I've got backups. Sure I do. All right, I'm going to leave now. My heart's back in rhythm. It's all good. All good. Thank you.
Karen on? No? She teaches humanities here. She's really, really fun teacher. But I just saw those, and I opened it, and I saw it had a couple flash drives in there, but I didn't know who it belonged to, so I thought, well, I'll leave it sit here. Somebody will be back for them. I didn't know it was her. So anyway, Spain was probably not in a position to really do anything to us or to their own colonies because they just didn't have the wherewithal at this point to do it. So it was kind of directed at Spain, and maybe we thought we could get away with it with Spain because we knew that their empire was kind of falling apart. But, you know, I'm sure some of the other European countries just kind of chuckled, like, oh yeah, right. Now, that's not the case today. And this statement became more and more important throughout our history, and it's obviously something we still, we hold very dear, and I think the rest of the world recognizes that we will do something if they try to come into our hemisphere. Now, some of the things that happened under Monroe, not necessarily that he did them, is he had named John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, which is interesting in and of itself because John Quincy Adams would have been more of a Federalist. Federalist, I have to apologize. I got Invisalign this week, and I feel like I can't talk without lisping or spitting or something. So my mouth is still getting used to these things, and so I apologize. Anyway, the Federalist Party is pretty much gone, but John Quincy Adams would still be basically as a mentality of a Federalist, just like his dad had been. John Quincy Adams is named Secretary of State because Monroe is trying to bring Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists together. It's one of the few times somebody's actually done that in our history. So he names John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, and under John Quincy Adams, there were several treaties that were signed in this period of time that were kind of important. One of them setting the border over in the west above Oregon in terms of where the border is between the United States and Canada. This one probably the most important. This is when we got Florida back. Again, Spain is falling apart at this point in our history, so we were able to negotiate a treaty with them and we regained Florida. That's called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And then, we already talked about this, but under John Quincy Adams, giving that official recognition to those 5 countries that had declared their independence in Central and South America, one of which was Mexico. Mexico is going to play an important part in our history in the next decade or so after this. And then also a treaty with Russia because Russia had territory up in the far west north and settling a border there, so we don't end up having to have any kind of warfare with these different countries. That's what's on this map, if I can get it to come up appropriately. Maybe, maybe not. Got to be a better way. Now, I know it's not great, but the red line is the Adams-Onis Treaty, which basically set apart what was still Spanish territory. And then Florida had been theirs, and Florida becomes ours. So this line divides what's Spanish and what is U.S. territory. The purple line at the top is the one that has to do with separating us from Canada, what's officially Canada and what's officially U.S. territory. And the green line is the one with Russia because the very high part up there is still Russian territory at this point in time. Now, as you can see with there, it says the Oregon Territory is U.S. and Great Britain. At this point in time, the Oregon Territory was not considered British or American, but it was jointly occupied. Because there were some British people there were some Americans there. There weren't that many people there, so they didn't need to fight about it yet. We don't need to decide this because they kind of lived together and worked together. Eventually it's going to become an issue, but not until the 1840s. So these were the three treaty lines that John Quincy Adams negotiated during the time he was Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, he was more successful than he ever was as president. He was a very good Secretary of State. He doesn't accomplish much when he becomes president, but we'll talk more about that later. Let me see something. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the Missouri. Well, just very quickly, the only real problem during the Monroe presidency is there was a short financial crisis in 1819. It doesn't last a real long time, but it was enough to cause people to point their animosity toward the bank. They tended to blame the bank for what was happening because this was a new thing that we had rechartered in 1816 and a lot of people weren't happy with it, and that's going to kind of set the stage for the bank becoming more of a political issue later. But let's talk about the Missouri Compromise. As I said before, we had been trying to get states to come into the Union one free, one slave, one free, one slave, to keep it even so that when they voted on stuff in Congress, it would be relatively, equal as far as people who were for or against slavery. In 1819, Missouri decided it wants to come into the Union, so it applies for admission to the Union as a slave state. But even within Missouri, there were people that wanted slavery to disappear over time. And so there was a bill that was proposed as an amendment which would limit slavery in terms of any new slaves coming to the state, but also saying that the ones who are currently there would be emancipated after a certain number of years. But that didn't make everybody happy because many people in Missouri wanted to be able to hold onto their slaves forever. So it stirs this controversy that goes on for a couple of years between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. There were already 22 states in the Union. If you brought Missouri in as a slave state, you would have 12 slave and 11 free. So that was another reason why people were upset, because it wouldn't be balanced any longer. In the midst of all of this, Maine decides it wants to come into the Union. Maine had been part of Massachusetts. It wants to become a separate state. Now, what do you think Maine's going to be?
Free.
Free. So that would make it even again. So part of the compromise, the Missouri Compromise, was to let Maine come in as free, let Missouri come in as slave, and now we're back to being even, 12 and 12. However, that's not the important part of the compromise. The important part is that they decided to try to solve this issue into the future. And what they decided to do is to draw a line across the country that anything above this line would have to come into the Union as a free state. Anything below the line didn't have to be slave, but it could be. So we won't have to have this debate, into the future. We can just say, here's the line. If it's above, it's got to be free. If it's below, they can decide if they want to be slave or free. That's the real point of the Missouri Compromise, not the fact that Missouri and Maine came in at the same time. And the line was drawn at the 3630 parallel. Okay, people. So the yellow are all the free states, the purple are obviously the slave states. And then here's the line. Now why does the line only go to here?
Spanish.
Yeah, at this point, we don't own that territory out there. That's why the line only goes to that particular point. What territory is below that line that could come in as a slave state? Texas doesn't belong to us.
Oh, that's below that line.
Arkansas and
Yeah, see, Arkansas is not a state yet, it's a territory. So the only thing that's below that line, well, you got this, and then Florida wasn't a state yet either. Those are the only two things that are below the line that could come in as a slave state. What's above the line?
a whole lot of unorganized territory.
The green area, which is called unorganized, because we don't really have any kind of government there. Nothing's been, I mean, there's probably some people living there, but mostly Indians. So at this point in time, when they drew the line, those people who were really thinking into the future figured that we probably someday would own the rest of the country. And if we did, we would just continue to draw a line across the country. So this line would be extended across the country, and we'd do the same thing. Other people weren't thinking that far ahead. They were just looking at what we currently have. Nobody's too concerned about the unorganized territory because nobody lives there yet. And it's mostly where Native Americans are. So on one hand, this was supposed to be the compromise that solves the slavery issue forever. But on the other hand, nobody could predict the future and what was going to happen in terms of our expansion across the country. So this is an extremely important compromise because many people thought it was solving that slavery issue. It becomes like almost sacred in Congress. Because if we have done this now, we don't ever have to really argue about slavery again. Right. Of course, we know that that didn't happen. But that's what they were thinking in 1820. So it's really, at this point, a lot of people are breathing a very huge sigh of relief because they really feel that they have solved the problem. Now, from our perspective, we obviously know that that wasn't true. But I want you to understand that for them, many of them that had been in Congress for years, many of them that had been dealing with this slavery issue, they really felt like they had come to a compromise that everybody could live with. And it actually does work for about 30 years. And then we get to 1850, and that's when we start to have issues with this compromise.
Welcome to Henry Clay and the...
No, go away.
As America's new boundary lines were being drawn during the presidency of James Monroe, the nation's population reached 10 million. During this period of explosive growth, new states were being added almost every year, and the issue of slavery increasingly divided the nation. Mississippi was added to the Union in 1817 as a slave state, meaning a state in which slavery was legal. The next year, Illinois was added as a free state, meaning a state in which slavery was banned. And in 1819, Alabama was added as a slave state. At that point, the number of free and slave states was equal. However, the application by Missouri for statehood as a slave state threatened to upset this balance unless the U.S. Congress took decisive action. The leaders of the northern free states claimed Congress had the right to prohibit slavery in Missouri as well as any other new states created west of the Mississippi River. But the leaders of the southern slave states strongly resisted this notion. They feared that if the balance of power was shifted in favor of the free states, slavery might be made illegal, and undermine the South's slave-based economy. In 1820, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky helped enact a law called the Missouri Compromise, designed to appease both sides. This law allowed Missouri to be admitted as a slave state, but it banned slavery from the entire region north of the Missouri Compromise line that corresponded to its southern boundary. It is interesting to note that while the Missouri Compromise was being worked out, voters in the state of Massachusetts decided to create a new free state from northern lands that had been a part of Massachusetts since early colonial times, so that when the state of Maine entered the Union in 1820, it balanced the influence of the new slave state of Missouri when it became a state the next.
Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852.
Stop it. Hey, questions on the Missouri Compromise? Just keep in mind, the big issue with that compromise, I mean, it has to do with slavery, but what they're trying to do is to maintain the equality in Congress. That if you have an equal number of slave states and free states, then at least in terms of senators, you're going to have an equal number of senators, those that are for slavery, those that are against. Now, what about in the House of Representatives? Is it going to be equal there? Why?
It's by population.
So who do you think would have the advantage?
With the 3/5 rule.
Depends, doesn't it? Because you're going to have more population in the north of white people. The South may have more population in some states because of the number of slaves, but those slaves are only going to count as 3/5. So right at this point, to be honest, I'm not sure who has the advantage, but it may not be as, I mean, most of you just immediately said the South, and that may not be as clear as you would think, because the South has many less white people, but many more blacks. But the blacks only count as 3/5, so you have to kind of figure out, well, this population might be 1 million, their population might only be, you know, maybe it's 1 million, but if 600,000 of those are black, then it's not going to be as high, because they don't count that way. So anyway, let's talk just a little bit about the Supreme Court. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these cases or anything, but what I do want you to know is this first paragraph. John Marshall became the Chief Justice, we talked about him last week, in 1801, and he will be Chief Justice until 1835. That's a very long period of time to be Chief Justice, especially at the beginning of our country when the Supreme Court is just kind of starting to figure out what its powers are going to be. He has an awful lot to do with molding the Supreme Court and the federal court system. And we talked about him last week and some of the reasons for that. But under him, the power of the federal government was firmly established, meaning the federal government would have authority over the states. But that's not going to be accepted by everybody. Some of the states are going to have major issues with that. They believe that the federal government is encroaching upon their authority as states. And we talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Does anybody remember the main theme of those two resolutions? What were they arguing?
The states could override anything they thought was unfair to the federal government.
So Virginia and Kentucky have come out with these resolutions saying that an individual state can actually declare a federal law to be what? Null and void. So Virginia could say, you know what, we don't like that federal law, and as far as we're concerned, we don't have to obey it. Now, this idea that a state can do this, at this point in time, made sense to an awful lot of people. How do you think we feel about this today?
people in Colorado are probably.
That's what I was gonna say, because it's going on now.
Is it still happening?
Even with gay marriage too.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah,
was
but
a bit-
see, but the difference with gay marriage is that marriage has always been a state system. It's the state that issues your marriage license, not the federal government of the United States of America. So part of the reason why the states feel that they have the authority over that is because they always have had the authority over that. It's not a federal law that they're questioning. Now, the federal part of it that they're questioning is why is a gay couple treated differently than a married couple when it comes to certain federal rights, like, you know, can you be, the big case that was in California was the two women where the one died and the other woman was supposed to inherit thousands or millions of dollars, and she ended up paying a $363,000 federal tax bill, which she would not have had to pay if she was legally married to that woman. So her argument was, I should have that same federal right as I do in my own state, because my state considers me married. The federal government shouldn't be allowed to keep me from doing that. What?
Like they moved out of the state that they got married from. Is that what you're saying?
No, they were living in California where their marriage was legal.
Yeah.
Her spouse died, and because she wasn't considered her spouse according to the federal government,
Oh.
they tried to tax her on the money that she got. See, if you're married and your husband or wife dies, you inherit everything that they had, and there's not a federal tax bill because you're the spouse. But if you're not the spouse, according to the federal government, then you have to pay the inheritance tax. And she had to pay $363,000 in inheritance tax, which she would have not had to pay if the federal government considered her to be legally married. So she took it to the Supreme Court and she won. That's why you're starting to see a lot of laws change, kind of there's like a domino effect across the country now, that if those people are considered married in their state, the federal government has to treat them the same way. Now, here in Florida, we don't have gay marriage, so it doesn't apply here. But if you are legally married in your state, now they're saying the federal government has to recognize that, whereas before they didn't. But you're right, there are definitely other things where states are starting to challenge the federal government again, because they don't like the direction the federal government is going in. And healthcare is one of those issues where people are starting to try to figure out if they can just say, we're not going to do what the Obama administration is telling us we have to do. The question is going to be, how is the administration going to handle that? Because this is where we get into this whole issue over and over again throughout our country. Where does the authority lie? Does it lie with the state, or does it lie with the federal government? And when they differ, when they disagree with each other, who gets to carry out whatever it is that they want to do? Does the state have to bend to the federal government, or does the federal government have to bend to the state? What was happening in this period of time is the federal government was winning. They were exercising authorities, and the states were being forced to do what the federal government was telling them to do. So throughout this period of time, there's two things going on. The judicial branch is becoming more and more powerful, so that it's like equal with the executive branch and legislative branch. And then secondly, the federal government seems to be, in this fight, so to speak, the federal government seems to be winning. And the states are having to bend to the authority of the federal government.
Well, yeah, because they want to be a state, so they
That's
abide
yeah.
by the rules.
So throughout our history, and that's actually part of the reason why we have such a great country, because you have the three branches of government, right, that kind of check and balance each other, but you also have the states and the federal government, which are constantly kind of negotiating that balance. The states help to keep the federal government from becoming too powerful, but the federal government keeps the states from becoming too crazy and just kind of going off on their own and doing whatever they want. So it's a good mix, but it's never easy. There's always tension, there's always disagreement, but so far there's always been compromise. Well, I should say always, because the Civil War wasn't exactly a compromise, was it? But all of these cases kind of back up what I'm saying about how the federal government was kind of emerging as being more powerful than the state governments. And John Marshall has a lot to do with that. Now, whether or not you agree with him, it's maybe part of the reason why the country didn't split sooner in terms of the Civil War. It may also be one of the reasons why the country was able to reunite after the Civil War, because of the foundation that had been laid with some of these other cases. All right? Marbury versus Madison may very well be the most important one, because it's the one where we kind of decided that it was up to the Supreme Court to determine if something was constitutional or not, that nobody else has the authority to do that. It's the Supreme Court's job to do that. And if we don't like what they do, we replace those guys or women, I guess. But how do you replace them?
Wait for him to retire.
Wait till they die.
How do you get to be on the Supreme Court?
Get appointed.
Appointed by the president, right? And then, what's the word I'm looking for? Confirmed by the Senate. So, but the president chooses you, and then the Senate has to confirm the appointment. Typically, a president's going to choose somebody of his own party, right? But at what point does the president get to appoint somebody to the Supreme Court? What has to happen? Somebody retires or dies, because an appointment to the Supreme Court is for life. That's pretty powerful.
Like Congress.
What?
Kind of like Congress.
Well, not officially, but yeah, I know what you mean. But this is, I mean, this really is a life appointment. You could be on the Supreme Court for 30, 40 years, depending on when you're appointed. So you can have a tremendous amount of power if you are able to be on this court for a long time. And John Marshall was. I mean, he had 35 years, which is a long time, since generally speaking, you don't get appointed until you're like in your 50s or 60s. So I don't remember how old he was when he was appointed. But so anyway, those are a lot of the different cases. I think there's one or two of these I have asked you to know about on your list of terms, but I'm not asking you to like remember all of them. Just kind of remember the basics of the fact that it becomes more of a nationalistic court, strengthening the power of the federal government, those kinds of things. All right. We're going to talk more about this particular case here when we talk Chapter 9 after the midterm. This is another important case that happens under John Marshall, where he basically, it's kind of a, if you read it in the textbook, I think it's confusing, but the case really supports the Cherokee Indians who were being asked to give up their land in Georgia. Georgia was trying to take ownership of their land. They brought it to the Supreme Court. It's kind of interesting. These savage Native Americans, right? What do? They put a suit on and they go to the Supreme Court. Real savage of them. And it was declared that Georgia couldn't do that to them. It was their land, and that the only way that that land could be taken from them would be by treaty with the federal government, that the state government didn't have the authority to do that. Now, what you're going to find out when we get to Chapter 9 is he made this decision. Not he, his court made this decision. Whose job is it to enforce it? When the Supreme Court declares something, whose job is it to enforce whatever they've declared? Which part of the government? Quick political science lesson. What are the three branches of government?
Justice.
What?
Executive.
Judicial, executive, and legislative, right? In reference to the law, what is the job of the judicial system?
Make decisions.
Yes.
See what's constitutional.
Yes, but there's a particular word that we typically use. Very disappointing. Interpret. It's their job to interpret the law, right? we can all read it. Do we all understand it to mean the same thing when we read it? All of you that are married or have ever been in a relationship, you know what I'm talking about, right? You say something, you think it's perfectly clear. That person hears something totally different, right? And then you sleep on the couch. So it's their job to interpret the law. What's the legislative job? To make the law. They make the laws. They pass the laws. But then after they pass them, somebody says, well, my understanding of the law means I can do this. And somebody else says, no, you can't do that. So it goes to the court, and the court interprets it and says, no, this is what the law means, and you can't do what you thought you could do. But what's the executive's job?
Enforce it.
To enforce it. So they've made it, and they enforce the laws that have been made. If it goes to here, because there's been a question about the law, once the Supreme Court or whatever court makes the determination as to what the law really means, it's this branch's job to enforce it. So, John Marshall in his court said to the Cherokee Indians, you know, you're perfectly right. Georgia has misinterpreted the law, they can't take your land, you can stay there. So whose job is it to make sure that Georgia doesn't violate that? And who represents the executive branch? President of the United States. At this time, Andrew Jackson was the president. When he heard the Supreme Court decision, what did he say? John Marshall has made his decision. Let John Marshall go to Georgia and enforce it. Literally, that's what he said. John Marshall was 167 years old. Okay, maybe not that old, but close.
162.
He was knocking on heaven's door.
Yeah,
But there, right there, he's failing in his duties.
exactly. He should have been impeached.
I was just gonna say.
But wasn't he the one, was it Jackson? No, who was it that was impeached?
Johnson, Andrew Johnson. So anyway, we're going to talk more about that later, but this is an important decision that's made by the Supreme Court, but our own president doesn't like the decision and he won't enforce it. And the Cherokees were driven from their land. This is the whole Trail of Tears thing. I'm sure you guys have heard about that before, but we're going to come back to that week after next. All right. I love this election of 1824. It's referred to as the corrupt bargaining. Like I said before, Federalist Party has pretty much come to an end. It doesn't really exist anymore. And we don't really have two literal parties at this point. That's another thing that was said in one of those videos. She mentioned the Whig Party. The Whig Party doesn't really exist yet. So her mentioning of that is looking toward the future, not 1816, 1820. Anyway, Federalist Party isn't really around. So in 1824, there's 4 major candidates for the presidency, but they're all from the same party. They're just all basically Democratic Republicans, but definitely differences among them. And these are the ones who are running: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson has become, he was a war hero because of the Battle of New Orleans, even though it took place after the war was really over with. He also was known for fighting the Indians in the Seminole War. So he's built a reputation. He's been in Congress, and people know him. Everybody knows John Quincy Adams because he's been Secretary of State. He was the son of a president, been in politics all his life. Henry Clay, everybody knows because he's been a senator, congressman. At this point, he's Speaker of the House. The big compromiser, the great compromiser, that's always trying to bring people together. William Crawford, not so much. He was a Secretary of Treasury. People maybe didn't know him as well. He didn't have the same kind of reputation as some of the others. But the problem with this particular election is nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes. In order to win the presidential election, you have to have the majority of electoral votes. You can't just have the most votes. And so because of that, the Constitution says it has to go to the House to be determined. But it also says that only the top 3 vote getters will count. Anybody after that isn't going to be considered. The top 3 vote getters, as you can see here, were Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, not Clay. So Clay can't be considered for the presidency. Crawford has become ill during the campaign, and people are actually afraid he might die. So why are you going to vote for somebody who may not even make it, right? So it really just leaves Jackson and Adams, the 2 front runners anyway, for the House to decide between. So when it goes to the House, Clay, who isn't in the running any longer, he has support, right? I mean, there's people in the House that know him. He's the Speaker of the House. So he has friends. He has people that if he goes to them and says, hey, I would really like you to vote for this guy or this guy, they'll probably go along with what he tells them to do. At this point in our history, going back to this list of presidents here, Madison had served as Jefferson's Secretary of State. He became the next president. Monroe had served as Madison's Secretary of State. He became the next president. Who is Monroe's Secretary of State?
Okay.
We just talked about him in all the diplomatic achievements. No. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. Now he's running for the presidency. What has happened here is that the road to the presidency is not vice president, it's Secretary of State. That's become the door. If you want to become president, then you want to hold the office as Secretary of State. So John Quincy Adams had served under Monroe, done very well as a Secretary of State. Now he's running for the presidency. So Henry Clay, no longer in the running, right? But he wants to continue in politics. What does he want to be? Secretary of State. Because if he becomes Secretary of State, there's a good chance he could become president, right? So, supposedly, and I don't know this to be true, but supposedly he went to Jackson first and said, hey, if you'll make me Secretary of State, I'll help you become president. And Jackson said no. So then he went to Adams. He said, you name me Secretary of State, I'll help you become president. And Adams said yes. So he goes back to Congress, tells his buddies, when we vote, I want you to vote for John Quincy Adams. And that's what they did. Adams becomes president, and he names Henry Clay as Secretary of State. So that's called the corrupt bargain. Because, I mean, Jackson had been the front runner, right? He feels like the election was stolen from him. So, of course, he's the one calling it a corrupt bargain, he and his followers. Do Adams and Clay feel like they've done anything wrong? Do you think they've done anything wrong?
Happens every day in politics.
Just politics.
It's politics, isn't it? I mean, somebody's got to become president. Clay has some power, right? He's got some influence. You can't blame the guy for using it to get to where he wants to be. But John Calhoun will end up becoming Adams's vice president, and the two of them can't get along at all. We're going to talk more about John Calhoun over the next weeks, but it's not a good situation. And because Adams is more of a Federalist than a Democratic Republican, he doesn't really get along with too many people at all. And everything he attempts to do, somebody tries to undermine him. He has the same experience that his dad did when his dad was president. He just cannot get Congress to follow him. Part of it is his own personality. He's just not a nice guy. Very difficult and arrogant and snooty, but smart. I mean, he was great as a Secretary of State for some reason, which doesn't really make sense to me because you have to be able to negotiate as a Secretary of State. He seemed to be able to do that, but he couldn't get the American people to really follow him. So he doesn't accomplish much as president. I don't know if this is going to show up very well, but I want to show you a cartoon that I think is pretty funny. That's not the cartoon. Come on. You can do it. Can you tell what's going on there? This is Andrew Jackson, and as you can see, somebody's pulling the rug out from under him. You see how this guy is in a chair with a blanket on him? Who do you think that is? Who got sick and William Crawford, the guy that was third, but yet because he's ill, people aren't going to vote for him. So that's William Crawford. This is John Quincy Adams. That's Henry Clay. That is John Calhoun. This, I think, is Daniel Webster, and this is somebody that I can't ever remember his name because he never comes up again. But I love that cartoon. And because of this election, Jackson is very upset, as you would expect him to be, and he is determined that he's going to come back in the next election and win. So, as I said before, John Quincy Adams, he actually has some pretty good ideas, especially about education and internal improvements and things like that, but he can't hardly get anything passed. Nobody wants to vote for his programs. So even though he's got some great ideas, they don't go very well. He also signs into law the Tariff of 1828, which is going to end up being a major sticking point for many people. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. This is an interesting thing here. July 4th, 1826. That's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And on that very day, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the second president and the third president of the United States, died within hours of each other. Kind of weird.
When did they die?
They were 150 years old. I don't know.
You know what the devil come to?
But as they were lying there dying, I mean, they weren't like in the same city or anything.
Holding hands.
Yeah. Singing Kumbaya. John Adams said some of his last words, if not his last words, were, "At least Thomas still lives." Not knowing that, I don't remember which one died first, but not knowing that Jefferson. Jefferson dies first. But Adams supposedly said that right at the end. Now, the two of them went from being friends to hating each other to, in their old age, being friends again, because they'd seen so much that by the time they were in their old age, they realized that their differences maybe weren't as great as they thought they had been in the beginning, which I think is often true
Kind of
of,
like Clinton and Bush Senior.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, so election of 1828, very interesting election. Again, it's Adams versus Jackson. Adams has lost popularity, though, because he didn't have a good run in his years of the presidency. Now we start to see a split into different parties. Again, this is kind of a very short-term thing here, but they actually call themselves National Republicans and Democratic Republicans. Adams representing the National Republicans and Jackson the Democratic Republicans. Adams is supported by those people that still have kind of that Federalist mindset, but Jackson is building a much wider coalition, and he's really appealing to the average person. He's trying to present himself as the common man. which he's not, because he's filthy rich and owns slaves and everything else. But he does come from a more, I mean, the Adamses were gentry, you know, they were always upper class. Jackson had to kind of get there, you know, the whole thing about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of thing. So that's kind of how he can present himself as the common man. And it's interesting here because Calhoun decides to run with Jackson, even though he's currently Adams' vice president. That's how much he doesn't like Adams. So anyway, it becomes this kind of, you know, we're the people, you're the wealthy, rich, that don't care about anybody, those kind of things. But it also becomes one of the most, you know, we think of people today and how horrible elections can get and all the mud that they sling at each other. It was just as bad back then. They just didn't have the media that we do today. And in particular, Jackson's wife, Rachel, it came out during this election that when she married Jackson, she wasn't officially divorced from her first husband, which she didn't know. Because, you know, he's the guy at that point in time. He has to file the paperwork, and as far as she knew, he had done that. Well, he hadn't. So she was still married when she marries Jackson. So they called her an adulteress, which, you know, today, who cares? But back then, they cared. And she was a very religious woman, and she took this to heart and supposedly was so distraught over it that she became ill and she actually dies. So Jackson never forgives the people who treated her that way, and it definitely causes him to treat some people pretty poorly when he becomes president. It's also an important election because more and more people are taking it seriously. As you can see here, in 1824, only 27% of the people who were eligible to vote actually voted. 27%. That's horrible. Only 1 out of 4 people took it seriously enough to come out and vote. But look at this. It jumps to 58%. It doubles in that 4-year period. Because many people were very unhappy that John Quincy Adams became president. And they were like, man, we should have voted. So then it even goes up by 1840, 80% of the people who were allowed to vote actually voted. That's amazing. We've never hit that number since then. What's it been averaging in the last like 20 years? Does anybody know?
Is it like 40 or 50%? Pretty low.
Right around 50%. I think it was a little higher maybe in the last election, but the average is right around 50%. So out of all of us who can vote, and today obviously it's men and women and blacks and, you know, everybody else, it was much more limited back then, but out of all of us that can vote, we still only have 1 out of every 2 that actually go out and vote. And if you're talking about local elections, a whole lot worse. Local elections is more like 10 to 20% that people go out for, you know, when it's just something in your community. I mean, most of us don't even probably have any idea what, like, our city councils do, stuff like that. I mean, I have to be honest, I don't probably have a real good handle on my local politics at all. But we tend to vote when it's the presidential election, right? And yet, in actuality, how much power does our president really have? Because Congress makes the laws. And if the president doesn't have, if his party doesn't control Congress, not a whole lot he or she's really able to do. The one thing, I mean, I have to, you know, in all honesty, I was pretty excited about Obama getting elected, probably more because of the historical significance, because it's the first time we've elected a black man to Congress, to presidency. But I am disappointed in him from the standpoint of, I thought he would be able to do a better job of bringing Democrats and Republicans together. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do by any means, but the way that he spoke back before he ever became president, when you heard him at the Democratic convention, I don't know if you guys remember that, it's a long time ago, you guys were pretty young, but I thought he was amazing. And I thought, this is a guy that could really get Democrats and Republicans to work together. And he hasn't been able to do that.
It's more of a house divided now with like the Tea Party creating this and all that.
Yeah, and I realize that that's gonna happen to a point anyway. But I think if a truly gifted politician can do that. Henry Clay did that. When was Henry Clay president? Never. You know how I said last week, you know, in that article I showed you, that John Marshall might be the most important American to never be president? Well, Henry Clay is right up there. Henry Clay is going to be involved in every major compromise in our nation for 30 years. He's usually the architect of those compromises that kept us from going into civil war much sooner than we did. And he was never president. But he had the ability to bring the two sides together and to get them to compromise. We don't have many people. Kennedy could do that to a point. Those of you that know anything about John F. Kennedy, I mean, he may have been screwing every other woman on the side, but when it came to Congress, he could get people to listen to him. Even Clinton was better at it than, you know, we just haven't had many presidents that are really good at that. Being able to negotiate that path. And I really had high hopes that Obama could do that, and he hasn't been as successful as I had hoped for. Another thing that's interesting about this particular election is that, I don't know if I have it in here, but when Jackson did win in 1828, to show that he was the president of the common man, he opened up the White House to the common people, to have a big party at the White House, a big inaugural party, and just to invite people in to visit him. It's the last time we've ever done that, because they destroyed the place. They came in and they actually like cut down the drapery so they could take a souvenir with them. They stole stuff, they broke stuff, they destroyed the carpeting. Apparently it was really like a mob just coming in and destroying the place. So last time we ever did that. Kind of proved to some people that their idea that you can't trust the common people makes a lot of sense. But anyway, we'll move on to Jackson in 2 weeks. Next week is your midterm. Your midterm is chapters 1 through 8. You have your list of terms. You have the essay questions in advance. If you have any questions between now and then, if you want me to look at your essays that you've written out to make sure you're covering everything, you can send it to me. I'll look at it by email and write comments and send it back to you. Or same things with list of terms if you have questions. What?
That's all on each of them?
Yeah, the list of terms, it's under quizzes and exams, and then it's midterm study guide.
And we come here next week to do that.
Yes.
And for this, how long has to be?
The essays, how long they have to be? I don't like that question because, to me, some people can answer an essay question very concisely and say everything that needs to be said. Other people may not be so concise, so it takes them longer to say everything, but they still get there.
So we can do our essay questions beforehand.
Not hand it in. You're going to have to come in here and write it out, but I think what you should do is write it out and study it after you've written it out so that when you come in, you're ready to really write it out. Or at least have an outline or something so that you
Is
can do
it,
it.
like, do we have to bring a pencil or good with pen?
Yes, actually, bring a pencil, because the multiple choice will be Scantron, and then your essay, have pen, pencil, whatever you want to write the essay with, I don't care about that. Anyway, but to answer your question, it probably has to be at least a couple of paragraphs at the minimum, because in order to, and as I said last week,
It's in format, the introduction.
jump into it with setting the stage, explaining it. It doesn't have to be a 5-paragraph essay. I don't even understand that whole crap about why you have to do that, but you know what I'm saying. Some kind of an introduction to set the stage, explain it, and then if you need to wrap it up at the end with some kind of conclusion, let's get to it. All right? I actually have a little surprise for you next week, but you'll have to wait. All right. Guys, have a good week. And seriously, if you have any questions or concerns about the test between now and then, just let me know, and we'll try to deal with it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, give me just a second. Gotta get her started on something. The ones that are circled, are the ones that you need to do. Is this okay, or do you want to step out in the hallway?
Step out.